And as this is the best PHP conference of the year, so we're going to talk about how to migrate from Rails to PHP, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Yes, I mean,
That's why I wrote Lotus to help you with that.
Okay, no, seriously.
By the way, how's the weather in Italy these days?
Fantastic.
Luca.
Okay, give a big hand to those three guys. We will have a discussion panel, and I expect everybody in the audience to have lots of questions to those guys, difficult questions. So the discussion is supposed to be, what about the post-Rails world? So, I mean, you two have written a framework which is, I don't know how to call it, to Rails and beyond Rails? How genius, yeah. So, why did you guys do that?
Okay, I'll pick the non-stupid answer. Because it was necessary.
Necessary to be able to write a book about it, or?
Yeah, I mean, I've been working on gems for 10 years, like all the stuff like cells and raw, and I have $80 on my donate button in 10 years for 2 million gem downloads. That's amazing. So I had to write a book.
I already have 200. I'm just saying.
$200. Actually, I don't even know where the money is. Like on my, does it go to your PayPal account or?
Yeah,
I have no idea.
Yeah, it's a Get tip or something like that. Yeah, PayPal. Okay. And then I have to file taxes for it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, did you already buy your boat, or is it
very small? Yeah.
Actually, I have a question. How would Vault and Trailblazer? How could that work together?
That's a good question. You know, I'm gonna have to check Trailblazer out.
So you didn't listen to my talk?
Yeah, most of it. Lunch wasn't sitting well, so I had to run out for a little bit.
Okay, let me confess, I didn't see your talk.
That's right. I've seen yours before. I've watched them on Freaks, I think.
So because what I understand from Vault is it's like I mean, you have backend and front-end logic in Ruby. So
yes, yeah.
So all the UI logic is written in Ruby.
Yep.
But how do you encapsulate or model the business logic, like, you know, like creating a comment or something? So let's say you have a form and you want to submit that form and create a...
So it's much more like you do it in Ember or something like that, where it's you know, most of the code is running on the client, and then your your client-side models are syncing back to the database and running those validations and permissions logic.
So the validation are run twice?
Yeah, on client and server.
Yeah, but that would work if you had a, like, you know, I mean, the Vault dispatcher in the backend could kind of dispatch to an operation, and then... Yeah, exactly. And then there should be some binding how to, I mean, it's just like, it's probably never going to happen because it's like...
What will this new framework be called?
Lotus.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think you'd have to have... I mean, we could get. Sorry, what are they called? No, what's the? I'm blanking on the name. Not concepts. The
operation.
Operation, right? You could run your operations in Opal and then run them on both sides too. You know.
So how do you do validations in general in? I was about to say Lotus. Jesus Christ, Vault.
So validations are. I mean, they're on the model, so we don't have it abstracted away. But the interesting thing is, Vault models, I think, are probably more like operations in that persistence is separate from the model itself. So you instantiate a model, and then you tell it, or there's kind of shortcuts for it, but you tell it where the persistence is. So you say, I'm instantiating a model. It can be just memory, or you can say persist it to the URL, persist it to the parameters, to the, you know, any different place.
But could you use active record in Vault?
Probably not.
But because I think when you say model, you mean like a model in terms of Vault, like a view model or something. And but you still need persistence. Like, how do you do persistence in Vault?
So the models have
so many questions.
Yeah, under the hood they have callbacks that say when they change their state. So you can create a persister class
Okay, and that could basically dispatch to active record, for example.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Exactly.
Ah, no, I think I understand Vault now. I like it. I like it.
I'm curious what both Trailblazer and Volt look like outside of Rails. Like you each are tackling different concepts. Can I currently take the ideas and apply them to Sinatra or something like that, or maybe Lotus? How does it apply?
Actually, that's why I'm angry that Luca is not here, because we already started to work out. Like, I mean, it's nothing special to run an operation in a Lotus action, because Lotus action is basically like a controller in Rails, dispatches to an operation in Trailblazer, and then you can either render using Lotus views, or you can use cells, because cells 4 is again decoupled from Rails, so you can use all the Rails view helpers in Lotus in a cell. So and we started like prototyping on that stuff. I didn't do it because I don't have time, because I have to write my book and sell it to everyone in this room. Also, please buy Jim's book and Ryan's upcoming book.
Someone please write a book for me real quick.
The guys over there, my crowdfunding slide boys. What did I say? So Trailblazer is already decoupled from Rails. It's just I use Rails, to be honest, for marketing.
Well, I mean, the good portion of Ruby developers are using Rails to begin with. So to have something like that you can start in one place and move to another.
I mean, it's Trailblazer is just an attempt for structuring the business layer. That's why I don't even think it's a big. I mean, I don't understand Vault in detail because I didn't come to your talk. But I think it could work like in a. Yeah. I mean, maybe it's over abstraction. I don't know how much Vault does, but.
So, but we're here to talk about what is the next. I don't know. What comes after Rails?
That's exactly what we're talking about. Vault with Lotus and Trailblazer.
Okay, so maybe we should go back. What did you think was like shortly wrong with Rails? Why you started, or why are you sitting here even?
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. So I think at least with Volt, one of the things I originally really loved about Rails, and previously before Rails, I was doing professional Java development with several different Java frameworks, and the amount of duplication. There's just a ton of duplication in these frameworks, kind of inherently, and so one of the things I liked, I'll say one of the things I liked that DHH said originally was, the don't repeat yourself concept was very ingrained, but as time goes on, I feel like it's really hard to make a fairly dry Rails app. Not so much strictly on the back end, but we're building these apps where almost all of at least the apps I build now, almost all the logic gets duplicated on the client side as well. Especially because some of the things I want search engines to be able to index it, so I've got to have something come out on the back end as well as on the front end, and so I think at least for me for Volt, one of the influences was just finding a way to remove all that duplication, and then the other thing too is I usually work with fairly small teams, and so some of the projects we do are what I would consider fairly ambitious for a small team. And as time went on, I sort of saw this trend where people are starting to say, I'm just a front-end developer, I'm just a back-end developer. And I personally love being able to do both sides of it. I think that's, it's great to be able to be, I don't know about you guys, but to be like, I have a weekend, can I get an entire app out by myself? And so Volt, in a lot of ways, was my own selfish desire to still be able to do that quickly.
So what about you, Jim? Do you disagree?
So for every expert, there is an equal and opposite expert. I like to think about, in every project that I've done, I like to think about what I experience with the framework that I'm using. Frameworks save us a lot of time. We kind of learn how someone else does their work and fall in line with that. But really, no matter what you're doing, it's likely that you will find different patterns for the way that you work. And so I think with the code that we've seen and the frameworks that we've seen in Volt and Trailblazer and, of course, Lotus, it's a different way of working. And even everyone in here, when you think about using these different types of tools, you have to consider the fact that you might even grow beyond what that tool does. And the important thing to follow is not necessarily how would I do it in this framework, which is, it's good to know that, but how might I grow beyond what this does, and what are the limitations of what the framework is? And I think that's essentially what we're discussing here with Rails as well. Rails does some things for us, but the cost of implementing your own tools can be pretty low. And so you can look at Trailblazer and Volt and Lotus and other things to consider what you can do to grow beyond. Like the example of reform, creating form objects to represent validations, or how you interact by updating or creating an object in Rails. You could actually build a form object yourself. It's just that Nick has gone down this path and he saw the pain points that he needed to solve and created a gem that makes doing a lot of that much easier. But it's the same type of thing where you could try this out yourself and recognize where are the pain points, or what am I repeating over and over, and how can I build a tool that does what we do in our project.
Yeah, I think that answers your question. Like, I didn't come up with Trailblazer like 10 years ago, like, hey, let's write something to replace Rails. It's just like I saw pain points in the view, so I started writing cells. Then I was trying to have validations for the same for the same model in two different contexts. No way to do that with Rails. So it just like started to work on reform, and so all those gems like just fixed a lot of pain in my life, and hopefully in a lot of other people's lives as well, because I'm a good person. But so I didn't really I didn't start like, hey, let's replace Rails, because I think, I mean, I'm one of the biggest Rails opponents, but on the same side I really love Rails because it is a cool framework. It brings people together. It makes it simple for people to start writing a web application. So I totally got away from this. Let's like replace Rails. I'm more like let's provide additional abstraction layers. And I think this is also how Rails will survive, because I don't want Rails to die, to be honest. Even though we have great frameworks like Volt or Lotus. Lotus.
I love it.
So anybody in the audience has questions? By the way, use Twitter. That's the Twitter hashtag. And on Twitter, there's also a link to Hackpad where you can post your questions. Anybody got a question?
While everyone's thinking, one of the things that I think about that I know, I don't know Volt well at all, and it's much newer, but I've seen
pretty
a lot
cool.
I've seen a lot of the work that Nick has done, and in particular, working with views can be quite painful. And Rails has a way that says this is how we do it, but it makes it difficult to step into the process in a place that you want. And I think Lotus provides more of that. And some of the things that I know you've done with cells, you've had to battle the Rails framework in order to get it to do what you want. And then as Rails has evolved, it's made other things easier in cells. So some of the frameworks we use, even the decisions that are made in the ones we're talking about now, you may come to find that I want to step in this particular place, and I can't do it because the framework says we don't do it that way. So that's some of the other things. The decisions that you make may be particularly relevant to why you want to add a restriction, or it may just be that it just was never thought of.
I have a question about Volt. So one thing that makes Rails great is, in my opinion, is all the view helpers, like simple form and will paginate or Caminari and all that stuff. How is that stuff done in Volt?
So we have components, which are where you can package up assets, all of your app code itself, and for client and server. So we already have one for, I just wrote one for pagination. What was your other example?
Form, simple form.
Yeah, so we have a fields helper
Form
that
render.
has all the renders with validations, does real-time validation.
So you still have Haml templates and all that stuff?
Not yet. So that's the most +1 request on our GitHub.
How do you implement views with method calls and you?
Yeah, so...
Do you still work in like markup, or is it...
Yeah, so it's still a markup, and then basically anything in a binding is a method call to the controller.
Okay.
So it's very similar to like a MVVM framework.
Okay.
So if anyone wants to implement HAML support, come talk to me. But basically, there's
and buy his upcoming book.
Yeah.
Nick is not busy.
Yeah,
can do it.
Yeah,
I'm totally.
Yeah, there's a intermediate sort of data structure to represent the compiled templates. So anyone could compile anything to that, and HAML could be one.
We got a question coming up from the Hackpad. So the first one is, how to introduce Trailblazer Vault to newbies on Rails Girls? Question mark.
Trailblazer in Rails Girls. See you later. No, that's what I said in my talk. That's why I like Rails, because you can teach it to people who have never seen a programming language in 2 days. And I don't see a problem in general explaining Trailblazer in Rails Girls, but I mean, Trailblazer is more. It has a technical complexity that is bigger than its Rails seems to be, and I don't know if it makes sense to tell people like, hey, structure everything in operations and here's a form object, because I don't know. Like, I don't think it's a good idea. What I'm saying is Trailblazer is too complex to explain it to people who've never done a single line of code in 2 days.
Yeah, I mean, you have to
be really smart.
You have to have a certain level of proficiency, and if you're coming from nothing or barely anything at all, you do want to learn some tool, and I think it's perfectly fine to say, this is how Rails does it, now go create a website, or web app, and you feel very powerful because you just follow the path of the Rails way, and you have something working, you're talking to a database, you have views, and voila. But only after you understand that can you actually see problems with it. So I think it would be great, but I would take little bits. You'd probably do this with Volt as well. Just do one small piece.
Like a form object or something.
Exactly, to introduce that this concept can exist elsewhere.
Okay, we got a question here.
I got a question along Jim's line of reasoning. It's that what happens in each of these approaches when you hit that wall, where basically the approach no longer scales? Because it sounds in each of your cases I sort of have to buy into the concept, and then I end up rewriting it when it's no longer valid. I mean, it doesn't sound like I can scale past it. Would you agree with that or no?
I think at least for Volt, Volt's trying to provide a foundation. It's not. It is somewhat opinionated about how to structure things, but it's all just classes mostly. So you can go and if you don't like the way the models work, you can just substitute in a class as long as it quacks like a normal model class, which is pretty easy to make it do. So
I think the point. So you're asking if you hit a wall, if you want to change something in Vault or Trailblazer or Lotus. How do you?
Let me interrupt you. I think like 2 years ago, Steve Klabnik was here, and he said something like, "Every time I try to use something else than Rails, I end up with Rails anyway."
Yeah, that's his classy line of opening his talk. It's true, but I think the point of like the way Rails is implemented is not ideal, and because we have like huge monolithic classes for a lot of tasks, like in Active Record. Active Record is actually well done, but everything else is really monolithically designed, if that is an adjective. And I think in Vault and Trailblazer you have like lots of classes that only handle certain tasks, and this makes it way easier to override and to extend the framework without having to figure out everything else, like how do the callbacks compile to whatever Ruby code in Rails and all that stuff. So I think the object design in our frameworks is
you also
optimized.
You also have I think at this point all of us have hit that wall against Rails where you're like, I'd love it to do this, and you go to dig into the source code, and Rails is what, like 250,000 lines of code or something, I mean, it's really hard to get in there and like actually build on top of it, because there's 10 years of, DHH had a tweet the other day that was 3,800 contributors to Rails last year, which it's cool that a lot of people are contributing, but the consistency with that is
it can be too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah, I think so.
It is
you
actually.
know? Like
effect.
I'm not a I don't necessarily agree with the benevolent dictator approach either, but it's really hard when you have that many people on that many lines of code. You know, Volt is I think like 12,000 lines of code or something at this point. So like that's very approachable. You know, when you do want to go and extend something, you can just get into the source code and you know.
Like an example in Rails is when you want to change the way templates are found, just an example, and it is so complicated the way the action view is implemented. So if you hit a wall with action view, you have to understand every little piece of action view in order to extend it. And that's because the object design is really poor, because it's like 7 years old. No one has touched action view in 7 years, and so yeah, that's like, okay, you either understand everything and extend it, or you just write your own gem or layer to extend Rails. And this comes from a non-optimal object design in the Rails core, not even in your application, in the core code. And that's the problem with Rails. And they're trying to fix it, actually, so all good.
Okay. Let's have a question from the Hackpad. How to handle database level validation in Trailblazer? Like, for example, unique number of records, etc., I guess.
So there's two ways to handle this. Reform already comes with, Reform gives you, or the form object in the contract, gives you all the validations that Rails has. But you can also, and this is in my next chapter, by the way, coming up in a couple of weeks.
Buy the book.
leanpub.com/trailblazer. If you have database-specific behavior, you don't put it in the model, you put it into the operation. So when you, for example, in the book, I have an example where I have a uniqueness constraint, but on the database level. And so we catch the exception that is raised by MySQL or by Postgres or whatever, and handle this error on the application level, but in the operation and not in the model. So you can use database level constraints if you want that, but the handling the errors does not happen in the model anymore. This is operation code. So it's like really low level operation code, but it is operation code. What's so funny about this?
Okay, next question. Next question is about, is there a specific type of application which suits to use Trailblazer or use Vault or Lotus?
What's your base camp?
Yeah, yeah. I think at least with Vault, you know, if you're not writing any front end code, I think, you know, Rails is fine. I think, you know.
How do you do JSON APIs in Vault?
Talk to me in a month. It's still in the works.
After the Hamel request.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so yeah, I think you know, Volt is very much. We're not specifically like single page apps because you can build kind of multiple single page apps inside of Volt, but it's definitely that's like more of the sweet spot.
Is Volt to me sounds more like a UI framework, you know, like a Qt or GTK or something, you know, like a widget framework. Is that what it is, or is it
so
like would you use Volt for a JSON backend, like a JSON consuming?
Yeah, I mean you will be able to.
But what's the point? I thought Volt is more about like binding widgets to Ruby.
Yeah, it's more about the data synchronization is a big part of it. It's almost a mix of a front end framework and then a data syncing layer to the back end, and then. So I think that we give you all the bindings that you'd get in Ember or Angular or something like that, but it's nice clean Ruby code and.
But it's it's front end. It's front end focused.
Yeah, it's providing you all the tools you would use on the front end.
I thought it's like a Ruby widget framework.
Yes,
which is used for for rich client applications, with windows and tabs and everything is.
No, I wouldn't say that, because I mean.
No, I mean up to the program, but it's like really rich on the user experience level, right? Like you have because you have these bindings to Ruby, events to Ruby bindings and.
Yeah, so it's so I guess that's part of it, is being able to, set up your bindings to your models, and then your models sync to your server and sync out to other clients if you want and things like that. So I'd say it's I wouldn't say widgets, like it's just you write HTML with bindings in it, but you know, it's those front end tools I think that.
So what would be the best use case for a Trailblazer application? JSON APIs?
No, I mean, Trailblazer makes it simple to have, like, I'd say any kind of Rails application that is out of control. So that's why that's why I wrote that's why I came up with it, because it's like you have a Rails application and it doesn't matter if it's backend only or if it's backend and front. I mean, there's nothing front end specific in Trailblazer except for the sales gem. So it's not like Trailblazer is, I would rather say it's more back end focused. But any kind of Rails app that needs better structuring is for Trailblazer. So it's like I think it's two different like levels of.
It's almost going after two different problems, right? Because you're kind of
that's why I want to combine it somehow. You know,
sounds good.
It sounds to me like these two frameworks they're really additions to frameworks. You know, additional tools that you can grow into slowly. So I can try some portion of Volt or some portion of Trailblazer and not apply it to everything. So if I have a new feature or I'm refactoring a feature, I can move it into these different things and see how it feels. Whereas, given I know a whole lot about Lotus, and that's why I'm here, Lotus is an entirely separate framework that you might be able to mount it as a rack application and move some things into Lotus while still using your Rails application, but it's an entirely different thing, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I mean, with Volt, it is a little bit similar to Lotus in that it provides you everything without being built on top of Rails. But there's actually a team of people working on, they're calling it Third Rail, which is a pretty clever name when you think about it, that is sort of an integration.
How do you get those teams of people to work for you?
I don't know. They just want to use Volt, and they're working in a legacy Rails app. So
they're combining Rails and Volt?
Yeah.
That's cool.
So I don't, honestly, I haven't followed the project enough to work out the details, but yeah, they're kind of using Volt to render parts of the Rails app.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm interested in. Yeah. It's like use Volt for the rendering and interaction, and then hook the backend logic to Trailblazer operations. That'll be.
I mean,
and of course Lotus. Always Lotus.
The interesting thing, though, I think at Volt is that you end up, most of your logic ends up running on the server and then just running again, running on the client and then running again on the server just to make sure nobody's, for security reasons, right? They're not messing with it. But so you end up where a lot of your, interface code and your business logic is really needs to be able to run on the front end.
Okay, let's have another question.
So one way to look at frameworks is that they should remove some kind of repetitiveness from coding. So nowadays I work mostly on single-page applications, and the biggest pain point for me is that usually you have a lot of duplication of code between the client and server. You have to do the validations, as you said just a second ago, twice. You have to replicate the same models on both sides, and the biggest boilerplate for me is that you always have to repeat the same pattern of creating API on the backend to fetch some data from the database, then create something that fetches this data from the API on the client side, and then do some logic. And so Volt is tackling this problem in a way, and do you think that other frameworks will do something about it to remove all of that stuff? Because for me it's implementation detail, and programmers shouldn't care about what happens between the client and server. Maybe all you should care about is data and logic and operations and the view.
I just want to say that that's the best question I've ever heard because it makes Volt sound great.
That's what you wanted to hear, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Volt is
obviously
understand.
Do you pay people? Yeah. And that's your team of people.
Yeah.
Come on, admit it. Did you
pay him? We've got plans, yeah. No. No, I actually, it's interesting though, because I see the same problem, and I think one of the interesting things too is, especially once you get data syncing, you don't realize how much time you spend writing REST APIs until you don't do it anymore, and you're like, man, that got done quick. So it's interesting. I think Meteor was probably the first one to do this, and I think we're going to start to see a lot more frameworks, whether in the framework itself or as an extension or something. I think it's going to, because I think as single-page apps get more popular, that's just going to be more and more of a pain point for people.
Jim, any comments? Okay, we got the next question, which is, don't you think that healing a framework by introducing yet another framework is a dead end? Can't we can't we fix Rails?
I mean,
can we with libraries or something?
MERB is a great example.
Hey, MERB is merged with Rails in 3.0. That was 4 years ago. You totally missed that, apparently.
MERB was a new framework that merged with Rails. That essentially Rails became MERB.
I totally disagree.
Really?
Or are you making fun of them? Because I don't see any feature of MERB, because MERB had a lot of cool features like cells.
Well, that's true.
Multi-threading.
It lost things as it came in.
It lost everything. Like MERB was awesome, and then suddenly it disappeared, and it's like, hey, MERB is in Rails, and so I went through the changes in Rails 3.0. Like, oh, yeah, where's MERB? Like
yeah, there are ideas that didn't get merged in, but I think you want the framework to evolve, and I know that even, like you said, the Rails core team members are looking at things like form objects and saying, maybe we ought to have this type of thing. And forking and changing words in the README. You know, so
not funny.
The frameworks that we already use, while we all know upgrading is really easy when a new version comes out, at least we can take the code that we have and make it better. I think, you know, it's difficult to say that we should, when we have an existing application, dump it and move to a new framework. That's a big challenge, which I think is why a lot of people go and look at microservices. You know, maybe I'm just going to take this tiny little bit and pull it out and move it on, rather than rewriting my entire application on a completely new framework. So I think growing where you currently are is an important aspect of what can be great and also painful about software.
It's also cheaper if you like, it's for the business. If you tell someone, hey, by the way, we're going to rewrite this app in the next 2 years, and then it's going to be awesome, and this object design is going to be great, they're going to be like, okay, you're fired. If you tell them, hey, I'm going to grab this and this and this component and actually extract it into a separate Vault app or into Trailblazer designed, Trailblazer concept, whatever thing, I don't know my own lingo, then it's going to take a couple of months or weeks, then the business is going to be like, okay, cool, do it. Sounds great. Like, I don't understand what you're talking about, but it sounds great, and it doesn't cost me 2 years of work. So the more we integrate with existing stuff, the better for both
I think in a lot of ways. I think, you know, my take might be a little different in that I feel like with Volt, I did kind of think of, is there a way to add this into existing Rails app? And the interesting thing, though, is with more heavy front-end apps, there's different constraints, right? So Rails, for example, has active support, which has a ton of things, and they're really useful, but you don't want to be sending all that down to the client on every request. And so if you're going to make an isomorphic app, you've got these separate constraints that you kind of need to work with. And so Rails wasn't designed with that in mind. It wasn't designed with code sharing and with data syncing and all these things. So, you know, at some point you kind of have to get the benefits of these things, you do have to start over at some point, I think, if that answers the question.
Okay. Actually, we have a community request to Nick.
No, I'm not going to take off my shirt.
It's not about your shirt, not yet. But we as a community, we have decided we will not buy your book unless you give us a discount for this conference.
There goes your profit margin.
You can post it on Twitter. No, thanks.
I have to speak to my manager. Jim, is that okay?
You are your manager. Okay, next question. Why do Vault models inherit from Vault model instead of a module include?
That's a good question.
Thank you.
I'll switch it.
Okay.
Easiest pull request ever.
Oh yes, send me a pull request.
I have a question. Why is it's called an isomorphic? Well, why is what?
You should have been at the
that
talk
was at
this
the
morning
beginning
instead
of the
of
talk.
sleeping.
Okay, yeah, no, I wasn't. I was sleeping. Yeah. So what's the answer?
Yeah, so that's isomorphic is where you share code on the client and server.
Okay. So
I think that's the source of Ryan's religious followership.
Isomorphic creatures.
So I don't know about Volt models or even Lotus models for that matter.
Excuse me?
What, what I like to do is if I'm going to control initialization code, that I put that in a class because you can initialize a class. And I tend to keep the initialization out of modules. So if I'm going to include a module, I find that it's harder to communicate to other developers that the fact that this module is included, that means how it's initialized, unless it has some kind of special name, at least in a way that the user doesn't control. But when there's inheritance from a class, then it's more obvious that you're going to receive some sort of initialization behavior from that class.
There's also another aspect. If you use modules, it's harder to inherit class, like DSL, like class methods and class instance variables. It's harder to inherit than when you use classes. So that's like a really technical implementation aspect, but that's why I have like cell view model and not object whatever includes cell view model, because it's a bit easier. It's a bit hard in Ruby to handle inheritance with class methods from modules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think actually that was my original thinking too. Is the initialization is, Volt models do some work based on what you pass in, and so it's always weird. It's more intuitive. People know to call super from initialize more so than they do when they're just including a model to do the proper setup for that.
So I think if you do move to a module,
I'll have to think about it.
I would use a name or something that just makes it clear that, hey, this is what's going to be handling initialization. Yeah. Because if you don't include that model, or that module, you have to make it completely obvious to everyone. If you want to initialize this properly, you either have to follow this method signature or you have to include this, and that becomes a documentation.
It could be the name of the module.
Yes, it very much could. But if you're not paying attention and you just want to inherit and get everything, but that's also a possibility. You could make a class that includes everything, or you can include it separately. Yeah.
We have a question explicitly to Jim. So, how does Trailblazer and Volt compare to DCI? Is there anything in common?
I think they're orthogonal. They're not specifically related.
But do you recognize any DCI-ish features in them?
They're like the context is an operation. An operation is a context.
I don't know if I know it well enough.
Me neither.
The operation is, I think, a procedure, right?
It's like it's one high-level step in your application is modeled by one operation. So creating a comment, following a shop, sorting a list of items. That's all. That's an operation per.
So that could be similar. So if you're not familiar with DCI, it's data, context, and interaction, and you take objects which are going to perform some algorithm in one way or multiple different ways, and you put them in a place where their behaviors, the cohesive behaviors, are in a single location. So if it's in this operation class, everything related to that lives inside there. So you can add whatever objects need to interact, and when they come in, they gain the ability to do whatever they're going to do. And so this would model a use case in your system where here's the happy path through, and here's where alternate exits. So I imagine the operation is similar to that.
So Nick, did you read Jim's book?
Multiple times.
Hey, I've been one of the very first adopters, readers, co-founder, editor,
manager.
Manager. Actually, I got the book like years ago for free, by the way, and I'm still I'm still following the development. I haven't read the 1.0 yet, but I've been following the evolution of this great book. leanpub.com/cleanruby.
It's not on leanpub.
It's interesting. In DCI, is it so you mix in modules into objects to give this object a special ability for a short amount of time, right? That's the
So Ruby has limitations in what you can and
yeah.
can't do. So there are certain ways to approach it. And my presentation is tomorrow, where I'll be talking about the tools that I use. And there are multiple ways to tackle that problem. An experimentation I wrote is called casting. It's a gem called casting, where in Ruby 2, you can take a method off of an object and apply it to from a module, rather. You can take a method off of a module and apply it to any object arbitrarily. It doesn't matter what the object is or what its class hierarchy is. So I experimented in casting and how to take behaviors and only apply them where you need to. So you don't actually necessarily change the object by extending it. You can just apply these methods as though they're functions, and the receiver becomes self inside the method.
But the concept is still sorry.
It's similar to refinements, but it's not refinements.
So you don't pollute the object by injecting a module into the instance.
Correct. Not if you don't want to.
Okay, but it's like I mean the concept in DCI is still you have an object that doesn't know anything, or it's just persistence or something, and then you add abilities for a short amount of the life cycle or something. Is that
the idea? Is that you separate the things in your system that exist for representing particular concepts from what they do. So the representation of what they do goes into a object that represents that use case, right? So it keeps your models very small. It keeps them. There's I don't know if it's called a pattern or an anti-pattern. This anemic model pattern where it only has very little information about what the thing is, but then you can send that into a context, and it interacts with other objects and does what it needs to do there. The benefit of that is that you can model your business logic completely separate from the particular objects that do it, but all of the behaviors related to executing some algorithm are in the same place.
But how do you separate your business logic from the objects? What did you just say? Like you separate business logic from the objects that implement?
Yeah, that perform the algorithm.
Yeah, but how does that look, for example, for creating a comment? Like you have the creation code is kind of like validation, all that stuff is sitting in a separate object, and then
so there's no opinion on whether or not the objects that are coming. So you may have a user and a post or something like that, and when they come together, the user leaves a comment, and inside the context, the user is able to interact with the post and leave its comment inside of
so it's not only about injecting. I thought okay. It's about the context. The context is kind of the operation.
Yeah, the context is I'll talk a bit about this tomorrow, but an environment. We have
Spoiler.
global environments, so we have instance environments of an individual object or local scope for inside of a method, but we don't have anything that represents multiple objects interacting, right? So the operation in a Trailblazer app might be that local environment.
Okay. Sure, why not?
Another question. What do you think about using Grape and Rails? If, in your opinion, is it really a bad idea how to share models between two frameworks?
The sharing models thing is interesting. I know on Volt, the third rail guys have that problem where the models don't quite, the thing I like about duck typing is that, as long as the models respond to the same methods, you can usually pass them back and forth. The problem, at least with Volt, is that our models do behave a little differently. So it's kind of interesting. There's a couple approaches. One is sort of proxy objects that map between. That's probably the best one. But it is an interesting problem. I haven't actually used Grape specifically, so I can't. I don't know. I can't speak about that. But
I haven't used it, but I've seen a lot of code with Grape. Sharing models, like they use a gem where you put in your active record models, or what, and then you share it, or what's the detail about this? Because I've done this a few times in Rails, in refactoring a Rails application. So we share the models, but we don't share the model code. So basically what I'm saying is we use the same database, have anemic models, so no logic in the models, and add the business layer, add the business logic in decorators, and that's how we share. So we shared the database and the schema and the associations and all that, but we didn't share model like specific business code. But I'm not sure if that's the problem here. We got lots of problems to solve.
The last time I used an application where we shared models was years ago, and one of the things we did with it was we were running on Postgres, and we used different schemas. So in a Postgres schema, you can actually sort of do inheritance, where you can have one app that only has access through one schema and another one has access through another. And so they can look at the same table, or you can only share individual bits of information so that one application can write to, particular tables or fields or something, and then the other one can only have access to others. So you might have the same data store, but separate the responsibilities of who can write where through Postgres schemas and permissions.
Yeah. I think too, a lot of times if you're trying to do two frameworks at once, you might be better looking at, running things as a
Writing
service.
your own?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
But I don't understand. What's the point of using Grape when you still have a Rails app? Grape, in my opinion, is like a HTTP dispatcher, and then on top of that, Grape comes with like deserialization and serialization of documents. But other than that, you have your code in your models or in your business objects. So I don't really understand why you would have, if you have a Rails application, why would you have Grape in parallel? Is it like a
maybe there's something.
I don't know.
Not up to you.
Yeah.
So you didn't ask?
No, one of the things I think
it's
of
Luca
is
from Italy. He's trolling us.
I think of Roar, right? Which is Nick's project for handling both input and output for representing objects in your system. And I think a lot of times when people want to implement their APIs, they do their Rails views, and Rails handles that, and then they'll decide, I'm going to do an API, and the API is separate. But Roar is a nice thing that you can add to allow you to do it in one place and have representation of parsing and rendering. Yeah.
So maybe the question is, is that a question on the chat thing?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
But I mean, maybe you can come to Nick and clarify later.
I'm absolutely not
speak up now.
HTTP and stuff is absolutely not my field of. I don't know anything about HTTP, and I don't know anything about persistence. I know everything in between, but don't ask me about routing and stuff. I have no idea.
Okay, we got a couple of other interesting questions. Don't you think that frameworks in general should be more view agnostic and not make any assumptions about serving HTML or JSON? That it shouldn't, for instance, ActionView be separated from Rails?
I think that's a tough question for someone who's written a framework that explicitly includes view layer with JavaScript. But I don't think so. When I think about Rails, I think of the router, the controller, and the views. The persistence changes, migrations you can handle differently. But Rails essentially is those things, and they're really tightly coupled. So if you want to grow beyond using ActionView and do something different, you're going to have some pain, at least until it's rewritten or refactored. I don't know. I mean, it's a decision that you make when you build a framework. This is how this is modeled. This is what we do. And yes, we separate them into different things, but essentially they're tightly tied.
So I mean, I think you can frame it in another way. Should there be a separate framework for the presentation layer and for the logic itself?
It sounds to me like I don't know. Shouldn't your business code be decoupled from Vue anyway? And then the result is that it's really simple to use my business code in Vault, or my business code in Lotus, or my business code in Rails. And yeah, I mean that's how I think at the moment. But this question actually just triggered something, because I'm now thinking, am I maybe too limited in my web application thinking? Maybe I don't know, maybe the future is something like Vault, where you really have view code kind of in your business. Maybe that's...
Well, and it's still separate, right?
Yeah,
but it's MVVM where you're calling into your controllers directly. Like, because I think the interesting thing is, Rails took the stance that we set up instance variables from our controller, and then those get passed at one specific stage. But when you're doing front end, the life cycle of those objects is totally different, right? You're not rendering HTML. You're actually those objects are alive and updating back and forth as things change. And so I think what a lot of people want is more template language support, and I think that's good. But your framework almost has to take a stance on here's how data gets from your controller to your view. I think it'd be pretty hard not to have some sort of opinion on that.
But look, what we are doing at the moment is we are trying to copy widget frameworks. Like, Vault is in my opinion, I think to me sounds like a widget framework. And what we're trying to do
when
in Rails,
when you say widget framework, do you mean like Cocoa or something like that?
Yeah, you something like you have a panel and you have an input box, and you say if this input box is clicked, trigger this, and then display a list, and if someone clicks an item in this list, handle this event with whatever.
Yep.
So, and that's what we're trying to do in Rails at the moment. It's like we're trying to have rich user applications with like a user experience on like the way it is in macOS or in a Windows application.
Right. Yeah.
And we're trying to mock that in Rails. And I don't know if the request response thing is the correct mechanism for that. So maybe it will be something more like Vault. But then the question is, how do we handle API code then?
Right. Well, and I think especially in Rails, you really want your models to be on the front end, right? Because there's a lot of questions the models can answer without hitting the server. Like in Vault, we abstract away where the data gets stored. So if you're just using local storage, it doesn't make sense to go hit the server every time to validate something, or And so I do think as we go forward, either it's going to split and just front end and back end are totally going to be separate, or we're going to find, there's a good way to unify the two, which is Vault, by the way. I'm just kidding.
www. The more I work with like web apps that do more than just displaying a blog post, like rich user experience, the more I think maybe this whole Rails request response thing is the wrong mindset. Like maybe it should be more like event driven, like where you hook event handlers to events, like clicking a box or checking a checkbox.
So what you're saying, Rails is great for writing blog apps?
Rails is extremely. You can write a blog app in 12 minutes, by the way.
Well, I think one of the other interesting things too is as we move more and more towards mobile, where connections aren't always there, the data synchronization, HTTP kind of runs up against its limits. So one of the things that is on our to-do list for Vault is to implement operational transform algorithms that give you. I know, yeah. That'll take a couple.
Say that again.
So there's what's called operational transform algorithms, which are when you use something like Google Docs, multiple people can, if I've got a sentence and I put something in the middle of the sentence and I add 3 characters, and at the exact same time someone puts something at the beginning of the sentence and adds 3 characters, it can merge those operations together and push my 3 into the correct spot when it gets added, so that 2 people can basically live edit on a document in real time. And so I think you can use those algorithms to basically make changes to your model, and then once you come back online, sync everything back together. But those changes really need to be stored in a specific way to do that, and HTTP doesn't make a lot of sense in that case as far as the specifics of the protocol. A post request doesn't make sense in that context. It needs to be, here's a list of operations coming in, which you could map over post, but it's kind of superfluous at that point.
I think this whole discussion makes me think about the fact that Rails is really not necessarily MVC in the way MVC was designed, right? MVC didn't include thin clients talking to a server, and it's really a request response modeling framework. So when you think about those individual widgets and things, that sounds more to me like the actual MVC when it was first created. And so we've kind of moved.
That's why I always say like MVC with Rails, because MVC was supposed to be like, you click something, it fires an event handler takes care of the response. That's MVC, and not and not like templates.
Which we're sort of limited by. If you're doing things on the web, that you have to include that layer, that the two things have to talk to each other. So it's never quite going to be there. You can get it close on the front end and then close on the back end, but the fact that they have to talk to each other means it's going to be something different.
And the latency between it makes for interesting challenges, right?
Right.
Yeah, but all the new technology that pops up, you know, stuff like everyone uses WebSockets now to push to the client and stuff. This more and more reminds me of working in a GUI environment, because that's what we want to do. Like, we want to write a GUI with a rich experience and not just web pages that get rendered. So the more we move on this path, the less classy Rails app makes sense, because we want to have a rich user interface.
Well, and it's interesting too, because
can't count how many times I said rich
user interface.
Rich. Because I'm going to be rich, because everyone is going to buy my book.
I think it's interesting.
Not unless you give us a discount code.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things too is there's 25, 30 years of building graphical interface knowledge that I think the web community is just now finding, like, there's a lot of things where we're reinventing the wheel, and it's been there in desktop app development for a long time. And so I think picking up some of those patterns is probably good for our community to be able to, learn from the past.
Okay, let's have one more last question. For you,
could go on for hours.
I know. We know. You can tonight. By the way, tonight's the party, 8:30. Nick, Ryan, and Jim will be there, so you can ask them lots of more questions, especially those specific questions regarding Vault or regarding Trailblazer or how to use DCI.
Or Lotus.
Or Lotus. Exactly.
Answer every question. It may not be correct, but I'll
you can still try. So please ask them those questions tonight or afterwards in the break. So for years, people have been stealing ideas from Rails and employing them all over other frameworks and so on. What features?
Namely?
I don't know. That's not a question. But what features do you see in other languages or frameworks that you would like to steal and use in Rails, Trailblazer, Lotus, DCI?
Good question. Really good
Vault.
question. Someone has to say concurrency.
Multi-threading?
I mentioned operational transform. There's a JavaScript framework that does that.
Can you explain that?
Oh, well,
That's the thing he likes.
The merging, conflict merging for model data. So there's a JavaScript framework that does that pretty well. And although I think
conflict merging on the browser?
So like, say, let me start over.
I'm sorry.
So yeah, like I was talking about a minute ago.
Google Docs.
There's a framework in JavaScript called Derby that unfortunately I think is a dead project, but they do similar stuff to what Volt does, where they're running the same code on the client and the server, and they do they run these algorithms to allow multiple people to edit fields and to make changes to structured data and then sync that back. And I think that's something that we'd love to bring in. I think there's a lot of when you're building a framework too, I think you kind of look around and you borrow the best pieces from everything, and then try to create a unified way of doing it.
I think the business and persistence layer in Ruby or in Rails is kind of great. What I would love to see, and that's what you do, is event-driven UI concepts. I try to do that with Podemo. That's like one of my oldest gems. It's like widgets, and you can have events, and then the widget gets triggered, and blah 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 blah. And this, I would like to see that more in like Rails, Ruby. This thinking of getting away from this request-based thinking into like event thinking.
Yeah.
That's what I would love to see in.
Yeah, I think one other thing. The asset pipeline, I think, is an interesting thing because it tried to solve a problem that's a particularly hard problem to solve, but it was kind of one of the first ones to do it. And now there's been, at least like in the Node community, for example, there's probably 30 solutions to the problem. But there's been some interesting insights to it. So there's one called Broccoli, I think. And Broccoli makes this interesting insight that really the easiest way to do sort of asset transformations is as a series of tree operations. And so they take that and you can really easily build, okay, this takes in a tree of asset files.
Like dependencies, you mean?
Yeah, so for like concatenation, for example. So like you could take in a bunch of CSS files, go through the tree, find the CSS files, and concatenate them into another tree that's got one CSS file. And so if you model these as single tree operations, it makes for really easy ways to build up sort of powerful asset pipelines without all the complexity. So that's something I think I'd like to borrow or steal.
So the question is, what should Rails steal, or what should other frameworks steal?
No,
what Jim, it's about you. What do you?
What should we steal
What
from
should we
PHP and put it into Rails?
I don't know. You know, I do.
Do you even know PHP?
All of it. Love it.
I think they have closures now.
I don't really know the answer to the question.
Typing.
But
typing and concurrency.
Soft typing, I think, is.
Is that the new one?
Ruby.
Soft
Ruby
typing.
It's not.
Gradual
doesn't exist
typing.
yet.
I actually would like to see typing in Ruby. Because then people will start to think in interfaces and APIs and not in, I chuck something into a Rails helper and it's going to do something with it, and then the result is probably what I want to have.
Nil.
So typing would help to make people think in stronger interfaces, which is...
Actually, the next version of Rubinius might have that.
Rubinius?
Yeah. Gradual typing.
Which
optional typing.
Soft typing. Soft typing.
There's a version of Ruby called Scala. I'm just kidding.
I don't know. I think Rails is developers of Rails are trying to add things like what we've seen in frameworks like Meteor, like Action Controller Live, where you can very easily do socketed discussions between your client and your server. I think that's great, and the more we have of that, that makes it easy, the better. But honestly, don't know.
Question?
Celluloid is a framework for a concurrency following the actor model. That's what I read some years ago.
There's actually a framework called Real.
But that's only like one aspect. I mean, it's, the problem in Rails is not that we don't have concurrency. The problem is that the applications are completely modeled the wrong way. And adding something like Celluloid is cool if you know how to use concurrency, and it sounds great. I don't even know how to spell concurrency, so but it's not gonna help making people write better maintainable business code. And this is why it's kind of a bit dangerous. The more technology you give people, the more they're gonna abuse it.
So you wrote a framework.
So after all, you need to write your own framework, right? At some point in your life.
Yes.
Yeah. Just so you regret it.
And I also want to have my verified Twitter account. And if I have that, I will stop doing whatever I do. Yeah, maybe that's...
Okay, let's have a last question.
So, a tough one. Don't you think that half of the problems that you mentioned can be solved by CQRS, event sourcing, and syncing the events from backend to frontend? So we actually have and plus applying reactive programming on top of that. So basically just like Reflux architecture.
Sorry,
I know that was a lot of buzzwords, but
what's the word? What did you say? What architecture? Like
CQRS
no,
plus
you said
event
reactive
sourcing.
or something. Is that how it's called? Is that an architecture style? I don't know.
No, CQRS is not an architecture. That's what I learned yesterday. But event
sorry,
sourcing plus separating reads and writes. So on reads, you have this operation, like in Trailblazers. On writes, you have events that you can sync from backend to frontend, and the frontend can just react on these events, like in React.js, and refresh, like online,
and
to
sorry,
be real time.
Were you asking me or Nick?
Like all over you.
Okay. So interestingly, a lot of that is what Volt does under the hood. So our two-way bindings are, we call them two-way bindings, but they're actually sort of one-way bindings from the model to the view. And then all the events, so say you have a field that you've bound to some property, when you push a key, it actually calls so say you bind to the name property, it'll call the name equals method and pass in the value. So it's actually using sort of method calls as the events, and you can add more arguments to get sort of more details about the event if you want. And then that sort of works its way all the way up to the server, which then propagates out. So I would say it is like that under the hood, but I think that's a little bit not as easy of like event sourcing is really cool, but it's a little bit hard to work with day to day, right? Like really, it's easier, at least for me, I think it's easier just to think in terms of, okay, this binds to the controller, or this binds to this property, this binds to this property.
What's event sourcing? What's the difference to like the way widget frameworks do it? Like something gets clicked, this triggers an event gets processed and returns an altered view. What's the difference between this and event sourcing?
Do you want a
microphone?
Yeah. I mean, I've read enough about event sourcing, but you'll do a better job.
Word,
so the difference is that in normal way that we usually do in database, you just update something in database and you have current state in database, whatever is right now. And in event sourcing, you keep all the events that create the history of the object, and so you apply them again when you want to recreate that object, and you know based from all the history, all the things that happen to that object, what's its current state. So that makes it very easy to sync it to front end, because you can sync the events and apply the same logic and get the same state, like with just a bit of delay.
So I played a little bit with Datomic, which does this and can sit on top of a Postgres database. And there's even a confusingly named diametric gem, which is the Datomic adapter that's similar to Active Record. And it doesn't operate exactly like Active Record. The project where I was using it, we actually had to write some of the DSL methods that we wanted from Active Record relationships. But I think any feature that people want in Rails or in a framework of their choice, you have to make the argument through code and through making it easy to use. So one of the things we really liked about Diametric and Datomic was that it was relatively easy to get in and use it, but the general population I don't think is going to dive in and do that yet, because there's still some pain points. So until those pain points go away.
Like the cost of it?
Well, you can actually go pretty far on their free version. But in terms of just getting up and running, that's the thing that made Rails famous. You just follow these conventions, just do this, and then all of a sudden you have a blog. So
and scaffolding.
And scaffolding, yes. But I think the argument has to be made with a very easy way to get in and do what you want to do.
Yeah.
But
better frameworks, sure.
Yeah.
But event sourcing, is that meant on a persistence level?
Well, and so like one of the examples I've heard, and I won't take up too much of your time, but one of the examples I've heard for event sourcing is I'm a bank, right? And I store every change to the amount of money. That way, if I ever lose the amount of money or screw something up, I can go and replay the log and figure out exactly what happened. So I think that's really useful, but I also don't think it applies to everyone. Like it's one of those. I think of some of the apps I built, and I would just have so much like leftover data. And storage is cheap, but it is kind of one of those things where it's probably practical to do, but people kind of hear about it as like you're storing every change to your database forever, and that's kind of scary, I think, for a lot of people, even though it may not actually make any difference, right?
Last thought, Nick.
I'm still thinking about event sourcing, because like I don't understand how does that help to sync with the view? Like, what's the difference between sending an object with attributes to the view?
It's sort of like sending diffs back and forth instead of sending the full object.
Okay.
Yeah, because you just send the events and you know the order of the events, so you can very easily reply them on the front end. Like even if there is something disconnected or something, you just, okay, I missed 3 events, now I can apply them.
Yeah, and that's what
get them from
operational transform is sort of a more advanced version of that has some conflict resolution.
Yeah, and you don't have conflicts in events because the backend is the one which says which one was first and which one wasn't.
Okay, yeah, but then you might get two people editing and overwriting, like the order is wrong, right? So like, anyway, we should talk about this offline.
It sounds like an interesting, to me this sounds like a on the transport layer. This is what happens on the transport layer. So sounds like a really interesting concept that could be picked up by like Rails or something. But yeah, but that all goes into this getting away from request response into this GUI development world that I'm hoping for, to be honest.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thank you so much.